Joining us now is NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley and John Sandwick. He is a former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So, okay, Julia, a lot to talk about. Walk us through the scope of these new executive orders and actions.
Certainly goes further than what we saw at the beginning of the first Trump administration. Take a travel ban, for example. In the first travel ban, there were 5 to 7 countries that Trump was looking at. Now he's saying any country that doesn't supply the U.S. with adequate information, those people can't come in. He's taking birthright citizenship, saying not only if you're born to parents who came into this country illegally, but if your mother was here temporarily and lawfully, and your father's not a U.S. citizen or here lawfully and permanently, you are no longer a U.S. citizen, in violation of the 14th Amendment. It also requires all undocumented immigrants to be registered and to be fingerprinted, and it calls for the end of parole programs like the CBP One app and this program that Biden used to allow people to apply legally from their home countries. We saw a lot of immigrants just yesterday crying at the border because they were told that these asylum appointments that they had waited months for were no longer valid. So it's going very far. He's also declaring a national emergency so that he can use the military at the border. They were pretty clear the military will not be doing the arrest, but if they just expand detention, continue building the wall, and work with state and locals, he's going to be able to get closer toward that goal of deporting the millions he's been talking about, Anna.
John, your reaction to this sweeping action the president just took in the last 24 hours?
Yeah, Anna, you know what? I think we expected a lot of these things, right? We expected him to deploy the military to the border. We expect him to do something on birthright citizenship. But like Julie, I'm surprised by how far they went, right? This isn't just using the military that President Obama deployed the National Guard, President Trump did in his first administration, where we put him in a supportive role to provide additional surveillance capacity for the Border Patrol. He's contemplating having tasked Northcom with, providing him with a plan to get operational control of the border, to quote unquote seal the border. He calls for the Department of Defense to provide the Secretary of Homeland Security with sufficient detention space necessary to end catch and release. So we're talking about building probably detention camps inside military bases with tens of thousands of immigrants detained. Even on birthright citizenship, he didn't just limit it to the children of undocumented immigrants. He says anyone who's here temporarily. So that means the child of a parent working on an H-1B visa, who historically since the founding of this country, essentially, their child would have been a United States citizen, no longer will be conferred the benefits of citizenship.
So, Julia, you mentioned the app that people had been using to try to make appointments to come in across the border, to try to follow the rules and apply for asylum that way. We talked to one migrant who had arrived in Tijuana with 4 small children who said she was in shock and, quote, "I don't know what is going to happen to us." So what happens with this app gone now? I mean, are people still coming across the border? Is there a process in place that continues?
It's the end of the road for those people as we know it. The path that the Biden administration carved out allowed people to make an appointment through this app. It took a long time to figure out the kinks, but by and large, it had been working for the past year. And since they started those legal pathways, they saw a huge decrease in the number of people who were showing up and trying to cross the border illegally to claim asylum, because they only allowed people to claim asylum that way. But I have to say, there is already a legal challenge. We saw the ACLU just last night call for an emergency hearing here in a federal court in D.C., saying that they can no longer say that the Trump administration cannot argue that there's any way to claim asylum, because if you shut down this, asylum as you know it becomes completely obliterated at the border. And they're going to challenge that, as well as birthright citizenship. So even though right now we're looking at a lot, it's very big in scope, could radically change the way we do immigration in this country, there are legal challenges and there are some extreme logistical challenges to carrying out these orders. Also, if you look back at the first Trump administration, those orders in the beginning promised a lot of things like ending catch and release that didn't materialize. So now it's our job to look at what actually happens and see what happens at the border and with people living in this country.
Yeah, and John, you mentioned some of those logistical challenges in order to scale up at such a large level, all of these things that is in the plan and in the works. When we talk about mass deportations, which was probably promise numero uno from Donald Trump on the campaign trail, we haven't had reporting yet of a big raid taking place, although, Julia, you were reporting that perhaps Chicago could see something as soon as today. What are you watching for?
You know, and I've always been skeptical that they could pull off anything close to what they've described as it relates to mass deportations. There are two just big logistical hurdles they need to overcome. One is detention capacity, and two is the backlogs in the immigration courts. I don't think most people understand that of the 11 million migrants living in this country, the majority of them cannot be removed from the country unless and until an immigration judge orders them, issues them a final order of removal. But Trump did two things yesterday that make me think maybe, you know, to provide a subject to those legal challenges that Julia is talking about, there's a chance here that he could pull something off that looks a lot like mass deportation. And one is he says clearly he's going to invoke the Alien Enemies Act. He repeatedly calls the situation at the border an invasion, which is in his mind, the legal predicate to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, which would allow him to, without due process, without any court involvement, detain migrants unilaterally and then deport them from the United States if it is not enjoined by a federal court. And then the second thing is this detention camps and military bases. ICE only has 40,000 detention beds. To carry out mass deportation, he would need tens of thousands more. He doesn't have the money for it or the time for it, but potentially building detention camps and military bases would get him around it. So I got to tell you, despite my skepticism, he could pull it off. I think that I see the plan that they're doing, and if they can avoid getting enjoined by the courts, there's a chance that we're going to see something that looks a lot like mass deportations.